Hello and welcome to this Mooccast, part of the open online course Understanding Obesity.
In today's Mooccast, we'll investigate some of the ideas around food addiction. The idea that certain people can develop a relationship with food that resembles a drug addiction. So far in the course, we've learnt that the causes of obesity are very complex, and some of the more common explanations are too simplistic. The idea of food addiction often appears in the media as an explanation for obesity. There are dozens of examples of headlines in the press that refer to food addiction. Here are some examples from one of the most widely read online news sources.
Are chocolate and pizza really addictive? Teams say foods might change the brain of those who become addicted. Food addiction does exist. Sugar-laden junk activates the same region of the brain affected by heroin and cocaine.
These are striking and worrying claims, and they're equally striking personal stories of addiction too. People's lives can be strongly affected by their relationship with food. We also spoke to Sally Marlowe, a researcher in addiction at King's College London, about her experiences of engaging with people showing addictive behaviours.
One of the really interesting areas of research at the moment, I think, is where addictions cross over with eating disorders. And that is this idea of food addiction and whether people can be addicted to food or addicted to eating. We don't have that evidence at the moment. That may change in the future. But there are certainly some similarities which are really, really striking. And for me, the similarities come in the descriptions that people who are addicted to food give of their symptoms, if you like, which have a strong crossover with the symptoms that we get in other addictions. So people will talk about craving, being out of control. They'll talk about getting into trouble financially because they're spending all their money on food. They'll talk about being extremely preoccupied. They'll talk about secrecy. They'll talk about shame.
So it seems clear that some individuals have an addictive-like relationship with food. But what's the scientific basis for this? Are some foods addictive? The idea of food addiction is a seductive one. We can all understand the power food can hold over us. The dessert at the end of a filling meal, or even the appeal of a simple food if we haven't eaten for some time. And arguably, the idea of food addiction partly removes the blame from the individual and shifts the responsibility from the eater onto the food. There is a physiological basis for this. We don't just eat for calories and nutrients, we also eat for pleasure. And we also prefer certain foods to others, usually ones that are sweet and fatty and high in energy. This preference is thought to be driven by the brain's reward system that highlights certain elements of our environment and generates the motivation to achieve certain tasks. Eating is a natural behaviour, and it's arguably natural to prefer high-energy foods and to overeat them. Here is Suzanne Dixon talking about reward and motivation and its importance in natural behaviours.
Food is a natural reward. We like it, we want it, we crave it, and it's been suggested that we can even become addicted to it. And this is partly because foods act on centres in the brain that control reward, centres that are involved in processing pleasure from food, or centres that are involved in our motivation to obtain reward from food. But those pathways are also engaged by other natural rewards. For example, they may be activated by sex or anticipation of sex. So these are natural rewards and they are stimulating the same pathways, and this is important for our survival. But these same pathways we've learned a lot about because they're targeted by artificial drugs such as alcohol or other drugs of abuse. So we've learned a lot about these pathways, and we can see a lot of parallels with those engaged with food. But what really remains an open question is whether the same pathways are engaged by foods as by these artificial drugs.
So does overeating equate to an addiction? It's certainly true that some people show addictive-like behaviours towards food. Asking about these behaviours, whether you eat when you're not hungry, or eat instead of engaging with other activities like work, form the basis for clinical diagnosis of food addiction. It's also true that the same brain pathways that are activated by goal-orientated natural behaviours, like eating and sex, are the same ones that are activated by drugs of abuse, like heroin. But does this mean that food is addictive in the same way that a drug of abuse is addictive? Well, at the moment, there is currently insufficient good scientific evidence to indicate that any food ingredient or combination is addictive in the way a drug is addictive. We seek combinations of flavour and texture in our food, not pure substances. It's also the case that the changes in brain chemistry seen in drug addiction are fairly well characterised, but there are no specific neural mechanisms that account for food addiction. Lastly, addiction can be quite hard to define. There are psychological and physiological elements, but there are two well-studied phenomena that accompany addiction. The first is tolerance, the need to consume more of a drug to obtain the same physiological effect. The second is withdrawal. Withdrawal describes a physical syndrome that accompanies sudden cessation of drug use. Withdrawal usually involves very unpleasant symptoms like anxiety, irritability, sweating, and vomiting. Neither tolerance nor withdrawal are commonly observed in the context of eating. So all these points taken together indicate that overeating is unlikely to be a substance-based addiction.